Welcome to the Multifamily Investor Nation podcast. I'm your host, Whitney Elkins Hutton, Director of Investor Education here at PassiveInvesting.com. And I am so excited to have our special guest here today, Neal Bawa. Neal, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me on the show. It's always great to engage with you guys. My engagement with you goes back so many years, and it's always fun to, have a chance to chat.
Excellent. Well, before we dive into Park Villas, 121 units in Tallahassee, Florida, Neal, for the listeners here, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background in the multifamily space, and where you're at today.
Sure. So I'm a technologist, computer science degree, data scientist by profession. I've had a successful tech career, about 15 years, had a successful tech exit. And during that time, I live in California, and so I was paying 50% of the big fat tech salary to the man, and got into real estate for myself for about 10 years before I ever involved anyone else, just for tax savings, and eventually managed to get my taxable income down to zero. It took a long time, took about 10 years, and started to publish data science around real estate in 2009. And by 2014, when I actually jumped into real estate from a professional perspective, there was a very large community of geeks and nerds following us.
I was giggling when you said Taxifornia. Did I pronounce that?
Yes, it is Taxifornia. I mean, if you earn $1 million a year, you're paying 53% of your income to federal and state and Obamacare. And that is just, I think, an outrageous number. I want to pay my taxes, but I feel that the system is outrageous because California overtaxes you. I think the federal tax rates are reasonable, but California ridiculously overtaxes you.
I had never heard that before. So I'm sure this is going to be the first of several giggles here on the show. I'm always
I hope so.
Whenever I listen to you. Well, let's dive into Park Ave Villas, 121 units in Tallahassee, Florida. Neal, just, let's rewind the clock a little bit. When did you purchase this property and how much for?
So we purchased it about 5 months ago. I think we paid slightly over $110, well, $120,000 a unit for it. And this was a smaller property than we typically go after because this property is strategic to us. So our typical purchase is 150 to 200 units. So we're right now in contract on a property that's, I think, 160 units. There was a reason why this property was acceptable to me, even though it's a bit smaller in size than our typical purchase. So our portfolio is about 1,4,800 units. So we try and keep it at that 150, 155, 160 level. And so normally we don't look under. But this property, it came to us because I gave a specific instruction to my director of acquisitions and his associate. And I said, I have a belief. And that belief is that because of what has happened in the 2020 and 2022 timeframe, so that 24-month timeframe from the start of COVID to, let's say, mid-2022, prices of homes in the United States spiked at an absolutely shocking level, right? They've always been a little faster than inflation, that's common, but they spiked at an absolutely shocking level and then refused to come down, even though interest rates are 7.5%, because of what we call the lock-in effect. So what happened is because of COVID, we cut interest rates down to 3%, right? Mortgage rates down to 3%. The Fed rate was down to 0. And so what happened was a very large percentage of Americans refinanced at under 4%. But my personal financing is 1.75% for a 15-year refi. So people refinanced, they got locked in, and now nobody wants to move and take on a 7.25% mortgage, which is what mortgages are today. So that lock-in effect meant that single-family home prices did refuse to drop when they should have dropped when interest rates went up. And so in the last 12 months, multifamily prices have dropped, by 25 to 30%, depending upon where you look. But single family prices went up 1.8%. That is bizarre. It should have never happened. That makes no sense, right? Mortgages have doubled. So when mortgages have doubled, single family prices should not have been the same, but the lock-in effect was so powerful that it's keeping homes off the market for an extended period of time. So I gave an instruction to my staff and I said, go look for properties that are being sold as apartments, but are 100% townhomes. Okay? I want you to find me properties that are 100% townhomes, but they're being sold as an apartment. So for example, if you Google Park Avenue Villas, you'll notice that the Google listing says Park Avenue Villas Apartments. We haven't fixed it yet because it takes Google about 5 or 6 months to go through and change owners, right? So we are going through that process. So when it's done, Park Avenue Villas will be called Park Avenue Villas Townhomes. And what I'm doing is I'm restructuring the typical tenant that lives at this property by building office cubbies and nooks and building, there's units there that basically are like offices. And I'm saying I can take half the units and rebrand them as smaller rooms. They're technically not rooms because they're less than 9 feet wide. But I'm going to basically rebrand them as rooms because my belief is this, whether it's Florida, and this is in Tallahassee, by the way, which is the capital of Florida. Most people don't know that. Tallahassee and other markets, there are people now completely priced out of buying a home, even though never in American history were those people renters. There are people in a 60 to 85K income range. And normally you can get an old ramshackle starter home, and that's what people chose to do. Well, that old ramshackle starter home is now 44% to 100% more expensive than it was one day before COVID started. And so you've got this middle America, people with two incomes that are priced out. And so normally they live in, at this point, their choice is that they live in apartments, right? And because what other choices do they have? They can rent a single family home, but single family home rental prices have been absurdly high compared to the day before COVID. So if you look at single family rentals, you'd be shocked at how much they've gone up, right? They've gone up more than apartment rentals, and those rents have not come down as apartment rents have come down, right? So apartment rents have dropped maybe about 1% in the last year. Single family rentals continue to go up 4 or 5%, even though they went up 20% in that crazy time, in late 21, early 22. So what has happened is there's this gap that has emerged that was not there in American history. America has always been 66% owners of homes and 33% renters, right? But because of what happened in the last 2.5 years, which is not correcting because of the lock-in effect, that gap is about to grow, and the gap is growing at the top end of incomes. It's not growing at the typical apartment income of 35, 45, 55K. It's actually growing in the 65 to 85K range. Right? Those are the people that were always buying starter homes. They weren't in the apartment market as it existed for the last 100 years, right? They're all of a sudden in the market, 8 million families. And I'm telling my group that we need to find townhome apartment communities for this new audience because they don't want to live in apartments. They don't want to have anybody above them. They don't want to have anybody below them. They want to have a backyard, right? And so I'm restructuring apartment communities that are mislabeled as townhomes, which was fine. Before COVID, they should have been apartments. Today, there's a new audience, and that audience has a dog and usually has 1 kid or 2 kids and does not want to live in an apartment. So I'm taking these kinds of communities like Park Avenue Villas and restructuring them for a completely new audience. And I'm doing it all across America.
I love it. I love it. And I can 100% agree with you with the trends there. We've been seeing it, here at passiveinvesting.com, but also, just personally in my life, continuing to acquire a property. So you closed on this about 4 to 5 months ago. When did you actually find it? And did you find it on market, off market, through a realtor? How did this all go down?
This was an on-market property, right? But again, they were not talking about it being a townhome. They were saying this is an apartment complex.
Mislabeled.
And so to me, well, mislabeled because I think Newmark is simply doing what they were doing for the last 2 decades. This should have been a label before COVID. But now there's a new audience, these 8 million people that are priced out. All of that just happened in the last 30 months, right? This is not being talked about. Middle America, 8 million new families are now forced into apartments. So I don't think that the brokers have really picked up on this narrative yet. So it was just, it was on the market. And from an NOI perspective, from its net operating perspective, I paid a decent price for it. I think it was 5.2 cap or something like that, right? So it wasn't that I was getting an outrageous deal. Today, I have a property in contract that is a 5.6 cap, right? And it's in some ways even a better property because it's larger and has more amenities than Park Avenue Villas does. But Park Avenue Villas, to me, is a pivot. It's a pivot from one kind of living to another. So visualize Park Avenue Villas. There are no second floors in this property. You walk up to a door, which is nicely repainted, and you open your door. So every single tenant walks up to their door, and next to the door is the typical window that you have in a single family home, right? So you're walking up to a door and a window that's yours, and then you go into the house and you've got a nice long one floor, unit, because there's no second floor, so it's a big unit, and it's also more rectangular, whereas a lot of apartments are kind of train car compartment sort of length. And then at the back, you have these backyards, which were not fenced in because, once again, from their perspective, this is an apartment. So
Yeah.
why would they fence it in? Because they weren't marketing it to families. They were marketing it to single owners. So the backs have lots of space, but there's no fencing in. So since we've taken over the property, we've started building, these back fences, and so we have these little porches in the back. We've done some work on the front of the property to make it look more townhome-like and less apartment-like. Everyone's got their own, door. There's no walkways, right? And so the other thing that we're doing is there was just a bunch of parking space. That isn't a townhome feel. So what we are doing is we're going through and mapping the individual parking spaces and remapping them and saying, this space that's directly in front of your unit, that's your space, right? As opposed to, well, we have a lot of space, you can park,
Park
right?
anywhere. Yeah.
Park anywhere, right? Well, park anywhere is an apartment complex concept. I want to have the townhome concept. So I wasn't able to do that for 100% of the units. So there are still some units where the parking is not directly in front of you because of the layout of the property. But again, I'm going through this process. And so as you go through this process and you start changing your gentry, it's a time-consuming process. There's nothing here that's magical. There's nothing here that I can do in 3 months or 6 months. Why? Because I already have 121 tenants, and those
Mhm.
tenants are mostly single people, right? Singles, which is pretty common in apartments. And now it's going to take me 2 or 3 years to turn this boat to the point where 60-70% of the people that live in this community are families. And when
Mhm.
I get to that point, my rents are going to be staggeringly higher, but I have to still go through this transition. So for the moment, the vision is this is a built to rent community, BTR, right?
Mhm.
Which is not apartments at all. And I'm going to take 2 to 3 years to pivot it that way by deliberately changing the people that live here. And as I go through that pivot, for the moment, it's just about rehab. And my rehab budget is similar to anyone else's, but I'm being careful to embed elements that are family friendly that I might not have done if this was apartment, but this is a townhome community.
I love that. I love the business plan and the vision that you have here. Before we dive further, because I do want to know a little bit more about the rehab, especially like the budget and what specifically you're adding in.
Mhm.
Let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. I want to understand like how you got this under contract. Was there competition? When did you walk the units? Let's get into like the boring part of the transaction, perhaps.
Of course. This was one of those properties that I actually didn't walk myself. So both my director of education, director of acquisition, and the acquisition associate. So there are two full-time employees whose only job it is to do these kinds of things. As it happens, the associate lives in Florida, so he was actually able to take a 3-hour drive to get to Tallahassee. I think he lives in Tampa, so you sort of go up and west. So he went there, he spent an entire day there. He came back and we looked at it and said, this matches Neal's vision. So he called Pete, his boss, and said, can you please fly over? And then Pete came in and they spent an entire day at the property. And they looked at the property and they came back to me and said, Neal, it matches your vision, but it's tired. The property is, 80s built. It's got an incredible rate, and we'll talk about that a bit later, but it's tired. We're going to have to do quite a bit of work. What they liked about the property was the brick feel. When you walk up to older homes, single family homes, you have this very nice dark orange brick feel. Well, the entire property, all 100% of the units have a brick fascia, and then on the side it has a stucco. So the front where the door is all brick, right? And then the sides are stucco. So they came back to me and said, if we buy this property, we're going to have to clean up this brick. We're going to have to make this brick really pop. And I agreed to do that, and we allocated some money in it for that. Yes, significant competition, but here's the thing. This is one of those properties where I'm not going to brag that I underpaid or I got a better deal than anybody else. we were the second highest bid, and the first highest bid was not a fund. We were a fund. So we just sent a screenshot of the fund bank account to the seller, and I think our price was $450,000 lower, and that mattered to them. So I always say this: funds are much harder to raise money for because investors just like the ability to invest in individual properties, which I think is a emotional response. I think that I, as an investor, whenever possible, will invest in a fund because I understand the downside benefits of funds. But most investors are not like that. So it's harder to raise money for a fund, especially if it's the first property or second property in a fund. If it's, third, fourth, fifth, then you've got some track record. Um, but on the plus side, in a market that's highly competitive, Whitney, being able to send a screenshot that all of the money needed to close is in the bank on the day that we go into PSA is something that people care about today because properties are falling out of contract continuously in the last 12 months because rates were going up. So every time rates would go up, underwriting wouldn't work and people would back off. So sellers wanted that certainty. So we made a very big deal of saying, we will absolutely 100% close. And because we had the money in the bank, we were able to put in a bigger deposit, and that got us the $450,000 discount. Altogether, there were 14 offers, if I remember correctly. The broker was friendly to us. We've done business with Newmark before, so having friendly brokers obviously is a big deal. So they gave us, so 14 plus, and there were 4 in best and final, and the gap was about $1 million between those 4.
And so how did you structure your deal? So we understand that, having the fun piece was probably what sealed the deal, but how did you just, actually structure the deal? Was it like a 30-day due diligence period, 30-day to close, and 30-day extension? How much earnest money did you put down? Can you give us details?
We put down 300,000 in earnest money, which for a 121 unit property is more than we need to today. But the higher earnest money was deliberate to get, basically to win over the other party that was willing to pay more. And we did a 30-30-30. And I think we closed at about the 66th, 67th day of that, especially because we were not actually in a hurry to close. And so we were able to get, the extension wasn't costing us dollars in terms of higher price. It was just we had to put some extra money in. So we went ahead and did that. So it was the typical 30-30-30 structure.
Well, let's talk about due diligence. So you have your acquisitions crew, your 2-man acquisition crew, walk the entire property.
Yep.
Did you bring in? I would assume you would bring in construction, since you're doing some sort of rehab inspection. Tell us what you found there.
So this property it did have a very interesting anecdote. So even though my staff walks the entire property, I just pay for a third-party inspection service. The reason I pay for them is I find that because this is their business, they note more things than my own staff does. So my staff is required to walk all 121 units. That's a mandatory requirement. As you know, for 121 units, it's a 2-day process. So my staff's there. Usually both of them. In this case, both Pete and Naeem walked all of the 121 units. But then we had a company that went with us, and I can't remember the name of the company, but there's many of these companies around. They're not hard to find that basically help you do this work. The one that we've picked from a due diligence perspective is the one that uses iPads. I find that to be useful because they have an app. I think it's called Inspector. It's in the App Store, and they walk into the unit. So before they walk into the unit, they tap. They've already set it up on the app, right? So they know what the unit count is. So they tap it in, they walk in, and they start taking a picture and a video using the iPad, which allows our team to look at the units. And then they flag the unit as high quality, medium quality, low quality. So we don't look at the high quality units that they flag from a video and picture perspective. We look at the medium and low. So that way we can either agree or disagree with their assessment. Right. So obviously we've also looked at the units because we're walking them, but it's nice to have a database of units in an app that has all the pictures and the videos in it. So you can go back and say, this unit, they're saying medium quality. No, we're going to bump this one down to low because look at what's happening with that wall. Look at, there's this issue or that issue. So what's interesting with this particular property, and if you're new to this, you'll find this. When I used to be teaching boot camps, I used to teach boot camps for multifamily way back when. I don't teach them anymore because I'm busy with just buying properties. I used to tell people, ask questions. Hey, what is a good percentage of units to walk? And some people would say, 50% of units. Some would say as many as you can. My answer is this is one of those cases where there's no rule of thumb. There's only one answer, and it's the only answer possible. And it's 100% of units, never 99. They said, what's the problem? I mean, it's 200 unit property. If you miss a unit, what's the problem? Well, here's an anecdote that illustrates why that you have to walk every unit. On this property, and this is very common, as you know, when you schedule that due diligence, the maintenance person at the site has this big key ring and they walk door to door, and they've already put up a notice on each door. It's like a printed notice that says, hey, we're going to go do an inspection, right? So because they're ready for you to come, because you don't want to just barge in. People, this is a fully occupied community. So the notices were there. And so this guy goes to one of these units and he knocks, and he's like, yeah, if nobody responds, then you pick up a key and you open it. So he does that, and he's like, hey, I can't, the key's not working. Sorry about that. Let's just move on to the next unit. We'll figure out if we have another key. So we go on to the next unit, and at the end of the day, he comes back and says, I'm sorry, I couldn't find a key that's working. It's a perfectly fine unit. You're not going to find anything wrong with it, blah, 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 blah. And so what he was angling for is that we would just accept the fact that we didn't get into this one unit. And so immediately our staff said, no, we live in Florida. We'll come back tomorrow morning. So just, find another key or whatever it is, or find a locksmith. We're open. Because there's a tenant living in there, usually you can just keep knocking and find the tenant and get a copy of their key and then make a new key. We went in there the next day. The unit was filled roughly to the 6 foot level, eye level, with stuff. So the same tenant had been in there for 17 years, was a pack rat. The person had put so much stuff on the floors that the carpets had basically melted away, right? And all of the walls, so they had put stuff up against the wall that basically had mold behind it because those things had been there for years, and many of those were things that were wet. So the unit had mold, and then on the floor was actual poop. And the poop didn't smell because it hadn't been there for a while. It was there in the corners, cat poop, so like little granules of poop. And the person obviously couldn't smell it anymore and didn't have an issue with not being clean. So I mean, imagine just a walkway that's 3 feet wide to walk through the entire unit, and everything else is piled. So it's a storage unit. And so after looking at it, our assessment of what it would cost to fix the unit was $72,000. And our typical construction budget per unit, or rehab budget per unit in this case, was about $9,000. So the difference between 9 and 72 was what we saved by simply saying we will come back tomorrow.
Unfortunately, I have walked properties like that you're describing. That's what when I did single family investing, that was kind of my bread and butter. If you're willing to solve the problem, you can get a property at a discount. But I love the words of wisdom there, because you can still run into those issues at multifamily properties.
It doesn't happen very often, but in this case, it did happen, and we get a chuckle out of it in our Slack channel. So we post pictures. These are horror stories, and so you always want to have your horror story pictures for the future.
It's what is the term? The smell of money, right? Like, this is the opportunity, but you have to be willing to solve some big problems there.
We did get a big credit, so they we pointed out to them that this would need to be redone, and they gave us a credit. I don't think they gave us a full credit. I think it was like maybe 25 grand or something like that. But but it is what it is. I mean, at that point, we were committed to buy the property.
So how did the financial due diligence go?
This particular property was fairly clean. So what we've seen at other properties is all of a sudden you have this flood of renters that comes in. We have had one property, and this was way back, maybe 6-7 years ago, where this property, the landlord was managing the property, and basically what they would do is that the unit would be $1,200 on the lease, and then they would basically hand back $200 to the tenants. So that way, that the tenant was paying $1,000, but the lease was $1,200. And the only way you can really randomly, you can check on that is as you go in for your due diligence, you ask a certain percentage of the tenants who seemed friendly. You know, there's grumpy tenants, they're like they can't wait for you to get out. And then there's chatty tenants.
Mm.
And we like to engage the chatty tenants. It's a process that we follow. A lot of due diligence companies follow it. If there's a chatty tenant that wants to talk, definitely make him talk because they're going to tell you stuff about the property. And one of the things that we ask them is,
We're gonna
can you
spill the
verify?
beans.
Yeah, exactly. They want to spill the beans. I mean, there was this one disastrous property that we got out of where there was a Section 8 property next door, and all of the Section 8 people had this big area, that this gap in the fence, and they would come through and use the pool. And so nobody wanted to use the pool in that property. So, you know, we learned that from a chatty tenant. So in this case, we went through, we probably asked 5 or 6 tenants to verify their rents, and we matched them off against the rent roll because if the landlord is doing this process of, you know, they're giving you kickbacks and things like that, the tenants always tell you that because the tenants want that kickback to continue
Mm.
after you take over the property, right? So they're like, we've had one property, very small property actually, that was about 10 years ago, where the tenant basically, as soon as we went in there, said, you do know that I have a special deal with the landlord, right? Right. And because he wanted that deal to continue. And so we immediately caught that and marked the unit down from, you know, whatever the rent was to whatever that special deal was. We marked it down for the landlord and changed our pricing. It doesn't happen a lot in these bigger properties if they're managed by a proper third-party property managers, because property managers will not commit this kind of fraud. It affects their insurance if they're caught. In fact, it could put them out of business. Um, so this property was properly managed by a third-party group. So we went through the lease audit, and typically the lease audit is done at the same time that you're walking the units, right? So you have 1 or 2 people from the property management group that we had selected, and we've got a property manager group, that asset living, that we've got had in other metros as well, so they know us well. Um, so they went in, they basically basically bring a folding table with them, they set it up, and they go through the 121 leases while we're walking the 121 units. Nothing sexy that I found there that I would want to talk about, except that this particular property was on the up and up. What I was surprised by is how poorly they were marketing the property to families, because almost the entire property was single tenant.
Mm. Well, and that's an opportunity again for you to increase the NOI on the property, right? So, again, part of your business plan.
Yeah,
Uh,
I think you have units that appeal to a different group. So
mhm.
this property was basically purchased because it was not highest and best use, right? That in itself is an opportunity. You want to make sure you say, what is the highest and best use for every property that I have? Maybe highest and best use for a single family home is Airbnb. Maybe highest and best use is nurse rentals, right? Highest and best use is really a question that you should be asking yourself, whether it's a 200 unit property or if it's a 1 unit property. And in this case, this property's highest and best use is young families with 1 child and 1 dog. And I
Mhm.
think that over the next 2 years, we're going to pivot pivot to that, and we'll do it a little bit at a time. And one of the key parts of that pivot is a frosted glass door. So this property, the reason it wouldn't appeal as much to families is that the way that the design is there's not enough light coming into the living room, right? So when we walked in, we were like, there isn't that welcoming feel. And the way to fix that, even though it costs money, is to replace the front door with a frosted glass door. Now, you don't really go through doing that on 121 units. You're always going to have a bunch of singles, right? So what you do is the units that you're targeting for the families, the ones where you've built those porches in the back, the ones that might be a little bit wider, the ones that where the overall size of the unit is a little bit longer, you add the frosted glass door, and then your entryway is not dark.
Mm-hmm. That's funny that you mentioned that. Like when I had my single family properties, that was, for the ones that were in the higher income areas, I would swap out the door. And my little hack there is actually I wouldn't pay for the frosted glass door. I would just put in a glass door and put a frosted film on it, because if they have the dog generally at some point in time scratches the
Yes,
frosting or scratches the film, then fantastic. You can just pull the film off and replace the film. And you've protected your
I like
glass.
that one. I like that one. I'm stealing it.
Yeah. And it's way cheaper, like hundreds of dollars cheaper.
Yeah.
Well, let's move on to the lending piece. How did you, you have a fund, but did you put a loan on this property?
We did. So the property, this was an assumable loan. Like everyone else these days, we are more focused on assumable loans. So it was a blended loan, and we got a very high leverage on the property. I think this was one of those properties where our effective leverage was like 74, 75%. So we were able to, um, they they had the property at such a high level of lending that we basically just assumed both of their loans. So they had a primary and a secondary, and we didn't have to do much more because that secondary was extremely recent. So why is this important? We were able to get a blended rate. So we had a primary that I think was around 3.9, and that was the bigger loan. And then there was a secondary on it already. That secondary was probably around 5.5, 5.75. So when you blend the two of them together, it was at 4.4. And because they'd taken out that secondary very recently, we really didn't have to get anything beyond the leverage. And so we were able to leverage the property to a fairly high level, higher than what we are doing in most of our other projects at this point of time. So it was I believe it was a, don't quote me on this, but I think it was a Freddie Mac loan that had a supplemental on it.
Okay. And when you did this type of maneuver, or assumed the loans, was there any sort of lockout period or anything like that?
It's 5 years. So at this point, we can't really sell the property for 5 years without having a significant prepay. So this is a 5-year business plan. But because this is a property that we are, repositioning, and not in the standard way, repositioning often basically means to rehab the property and raise the rents. This is a reposition to a different audience. And
Mhm.
I don't think that that takes 2 years. I think it takes longer than 2 years to get fully repositioned. So to me, I'm perfectly fine with the fact that if I sell it sooner than 5 years, I'm probably going to end up paying a prepay. So I can probably sell it after 4 years and have a smaller prepay. But if I sell it after three, I think half of my profits will disappear in a massive prepay.
Okay. But I mean, I'm what, 4.5% right now in today's market is amazing. Like, why not lock that in?
Yep,
Um,
4.4 was our blended rate.
4.4. Thank you. Well, let's talk about, how did you structure this deal with your investors, right? It's through a fund, not through a single asset entity. But so how did that work with your investors?
So the fund is actually very middle of the fairway. I've done all kinds of weird deals where, like, I've done deals where the GP gets 70% of the deals, and investors only get 30%. And I have a company where my investors only get 10% of the company. It's called Ugrow. So they have 10%, we have 90% of the company. So I've done a lot of crazy deals, but this particular fund, given the challenging timeframes, is a very straightforward fund. It's the 70-30-8 pref kind of template that you see over and over again in the industry. And this was the second property in the fund. So the property we already had an Atlanta property called Monarch Villas that was in the fund. So people had a sense of the fund. They knew that they were lucky enough to come in when there was a second property going in, and they weren't doing a true up, which, by the way, is something that maybe I'd like to talk about, slightly
Yes,
advanced concept,
please.
but I want
Yeah,
to
we
talk
don't
about
talk
that.
about that.
So here's what is happening. We were affected with this fund in a way that we had never seen before. So we've raised $299 million. The reason I know that number is my team is anxiously awaiting that extra million to come in so we can say that we've raised 300 million. So it's something that's going on in our Slack channels right now. So we've raised 299 million. We've never raised a single dollar from an institutional fund. We don't have any superstar investors. It's all, 100K type investors. And we have 989 investors. So another milestone to get to 1,000. We're waiting for our next raise. Actually, it'll happen in a few weeks, I think. So bottom line was that when we were, working on this particular project and we were setting up the structure, we said, let's make it as simple, as straightforward as possible. The first when you start the fund, it's going to be very slow because people want to come in later into the fund. And so we said, should we do what is known as a true up, or should we not do a true up? In hindsight, we made a mistake. And so
Well,
I'd like to share
can
that
we
mistake
define
today.
what a true up is?
Yes,
Because I don't
yes,
think
I will.
everybody listening here
Yes.
understands that concept.
So when you invest into a single property, your money goes into the property on the day of purchase, right? Maybe it takes a month, maybe it takes 2 months, and then boom, it's done. Your money is in there. Your clock starts to tick for your internal rate of return, IRR, right? Now, when you invest in a fund, right, that fund is open or closed. So a closed fund is a fund where first you raise all the money, then you put properties in the fund. A closed fund, everyone has the same IRR or almost same IRR because you first go through the process, a quick process of raising the fund and closing it, and then you go out and find properties. The downside, of course, of this fund is for a long time you have money there that has no return because you're still looking for properties. So a lot of people do what is known as an open fund. And an open fund, what happens is you open up the fund, you have a first property. Typically, what they do is they have a first property that's in contract just to kind of lead off the fund and say, hey, I have this property called Monarch Villas, and I'm going to be buying 4 properties like this in the fund. So you're going to have, 4 different properties, and I want you to give me money now, and I'm going to use your money to buy Monarch Villas, and then 3 months later, I'll buy a second property, and I'll keep the fund open, and then the new equity that comes in, I'll use it to buy the second property, and then some more equity that comes in after that for the third and the fourth. And overall, everybody will still own 25% of each property. So you're not really owning the one property that your money is going into. It's just the way that the cash flows, right? Over time. Here's the downside to investors of that. So the investors that come in early into this fund, compared to the last investor that comes in, there could be a gap of a year or a year and a half. Now, this investor, right, was there for 5 years. This investor, the last one, was there for 4 years. So their internal rate of return was 25% higher. Well, that is unfair to the investor that starts. So what happens is there are 2 kinds of open funds. One is called a fund with true up. The other one is a fund with no true up. We made a decision, we were overconfident, that we're going to just close this whole raise in 5 or 6 months. So true ups don't mean anything to us. We raised 300 million, we're big shots, right? We're completely wrong, by the way, because we had so much trouble raising money, and we've never had trouble raising money before the last, year. And so now we have a
It's been challenging for everybody.
very challenging, right? So now we're putting the last property into the fund. That's the one that's in contract in Tennessee, and the fund's been open for 15 months. So now we have investors who put money in 15 months ago complaining that the people at the end are not giving them anything. So now let's explain what a true up is. A true up is a process where a fund raises money in pieces, and it calls them phases. And once a phase ends, the person that comes into the next phase actually gives, in a way, some of their equity to the people that came before them as a true up. What you're saying is, hey, I'm coming in later, therefore some of my shares are really going to use. Thank you for starting the fund off and being more patient than I am. And then in the third phase, that group gives even more shares up. So because your internal rate of return is going up and your risk is going down as you're coming in later and later into the fund, your equity multiple should not be the same as somebody that came in a year ago. Unfortunately, this is not a true up fund, which is good for me right now because obviously everyone that's coming in is like, oh, no true up, and I'm coming in at the end. Yay, sign me up. So it's really easy to raise money at the end of the fund. It's really hard at the beginning of the fund, but I just don't think it's a very fair thing to do. So in all future funds that I'm going to do, I'm going to have a true up clause that says beyond the first 6 months, there's going to be some money that's going to go over if you're coming in phase 2. If fund stays open for more than a year, then that true up is going to increase. So we didn't do a true up, and I regretted it.
Mm. Well, I think that, thank you for sharing all that, because that's very different. Most of the stories that we hear about have like those single asset entity structures. And so you have a very clear waterfall, no, you're not dealing with true ups. You're not dealing whether it's open or closed, blind, not blind, all of those things. So that was very educational for all of this.
Well, I'll tell you this. I can tell you that the institutional level multifamily business, like people who have been doing this for 10 years and they have $250 million funds, that's how the business is done, right? It's the syndication model, which really started in 2013 after the Jobs Act passed. And it's the newer syndicators that basically do individual property funds. Once people have been doing this for 10 years, nobody does individual funds. Everybody does, everybody does multi-property funds. I am a investor in more than 25 passive syndications, and the vast majority of my investments are with people that have been doing this for 10 or 15 years, and they always have funds. So 500K minimum sort of funds. It's hard for our investors to get in because our investors want 50K or 100K purchases, but there's a lot more money And these are I'm talking about companies that have 20,000 units, 50,000 units, and they have a 500K minimum, and they usually have a fund of 6 to 10 properties, and then they launch a new fund every 2 years. So this is progression. It is your vision as a syndicator that in a year, 2 years, 5 years, this is where you need to go, because that's the only way to build a lasting legacy and a lasting company.
Well, on that note, let's wrap up. I have two questions for you, Neal. What did you find easy about this process for this particular deal that you thought was going to be a little bit harder? And then we can flip it on its head. What ended up being a little bit more difficult for you that you thought honestly would be easier?
So on the easier side was really the debt. I mean, having an assumed a property with 4.4% and having all the money needed to close. We didn't have all the money needed to we still had to raise more money after we bought the property. But the fact that we had the money in the bank from the fund, yay, was just, there's no stress. There's huge stress today tied to properties where you don't have the money there. And then the second piece was the debt. I mean, 4.4%, thank God. You can basically tell investors, I know you're not investing because of the high interest rate environment. This is just exempt from that rule, and you're still getting the discount. So that made it very easy. What was hard, which was unique, was the property is townhomes, but because it's a single floor townhome, it has an old look. So I had trouble convincing investors of my plan to pivot it from individuals to families, even though I know that that plan works, just because of the visual nature of the property. So the property visually was not attractive, and that gave me trouble with investors.
Hmm. Did you do one of those AI mock-ups of like your post rehab that like realtors do of a property?
I should have. In hindsight, you learn these things. So the answer is, knowing what I know now, I would have done a mock-up, but I did not. Because we felt that we're the kind of guys that do 150, 200 units, 300 units. This is 121 units. It's going to be a piece of cake from the investor perspective. And technically it was, because we already had the money in the bank. But you know how what you do is you take that money for this property. Now you've got to raise money for the next property. And how do you do that? You use this property. Well, this wasn't the best property to raise money for the next one.
Mm. Well, Neal, all lessons in learning, and thank you so much for being here today and sharing your knowledge and expertise. How can people find you and learn more about you?
So we do not offer paid education, but I'm an educator. My wife's an educator, mother-in-law, father-in-law are teachers, and I feel like education is really a key part of every process, every engagement. So we have a website called multifamilyu.com, multifamily followed by the letter u.com, multifamily university. And we host webinars there. 25,000 people a year sign up, and we host a dozen webinars. These webinars are all kinds of different things. I mean, anything that catches my curiosity. I did a webinar with 2,600 people signed up on how artificial intelligence will change the world. I did a webinar on how climate change is impacting real estate decisions. And then, of course, there's webinars on typical things like real estate trends, or Texas versus California, where to invest, things like that. We do a dozen webinars. They're very data driven, very fun, with lots of videos, things like that. We also do town halls, where we basically will take 25 articles and tab through them and talk about them and have people respond in real time. So that is the right way to connect with us, multifamilyu.com. I promise that you will never get pitched any educational product. There is no upsell, no subscription, and never will be.
Well, Neal, thank you so much for that. And thank you for sharing your time with us here today. And we look forward to hearing about your future deals.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Whitney. It's been a pleasure.